it is for you over there?
It's 6:18 p.m. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bulgaria's first podcast festival. It's great to see people from near and far, and I'm very glad to know that you're spending this evening with us, or it might be morning, depending where in the world you are. This event is organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria, and it is supported by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. We are very grateful for your support and that you support the association's efforts when it comes to improving media freedom in the country and organizing events like this festival. Don't forget that this is the first day of the festival, but altogether we have prepared 5 days of celebration of podcast creators, and hopefully you meet some of your favorite producers, podcast hosts, etc. We've tried our best to offer a variety of topics as well as speakers. We'll have talks, workshops, and panel discussions. If you're here, there's no need to explain what podcasts and podcasting is. Just very briefly, audio is basically a very intimate medium, and it creates a very intimate relationship with its listeners. I myself, I'm a big podcast lover, and there have been multiple occasions where maybe some strangers on the street have thought that this woman is crazy because I have been listening to a podcast, and depending on the topic, I've been laughing or sometimes even crying. So that's the power of podcasting, and that's what we'll try to offer you during those 5 days until November 22nd. I won't bore you much with long speeches, etc. Just a few housekeeping tips before we continue. For those of you, for the Bulgarians in the audience who will need translation in Bulgarian, please select the interpretation on your Zoom menu and click on the Bulgarian channel. If you are a social media addict and you want to tweet or post about the festival, please use the hashtags Listen Up as well as Podcast Festival. We'll love you to see your posts later. And before we continue with our first speaker, I just want to give the floor to Martin Cote. He is the Regional Director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Southeastern Europe, and he would like to say a few words to you.
Thanks, Bojana, and hi everybody. I'm really happy to be with you here tonight. And in fact, it is a total vindication for me to be opening this podcast festival. And I think you couldn't have found a person better suited than me doing it. Let me just explain why, and maybe you understand somewhat. I myself am a former radio journalist working for the BBC and Deutsche Welle. That's way back in the 80s. Now, I don't know if any of you might recall this 80s smash hit, Video Killed the Radio Star. It was played a lot on MTV back then, when MTV was hot. My point is, the line is just not true. It wasn't video that killed the radio star. It was radio management that killed the radio star. That's because radio managers back then invented format radio, telling us journalists that audience attention would only last for 2 or 3 minutes and that listeners would only take in tiny bits of information at a time. This killed radio as the medium of ideas, the best place available in the world, I find, to take in information, learn, confront yourself with your own prejudice, just listen and feel your mind broadening its horizon. Mind you, I really believe this is actually a sensual, and you said intimate experience, Boriana, and I really totally agree with it. And those managers, they just killed it. But it's back now, and these days it's called podcast. None of these managers would have ever thought this had a chance. But now you're back the world over. Now, you might call yourself podcasters, but to me, you guys still are radio stars, and I'm so proud of you. I'm also proud of IAG of Bulgaria, who made it all happen. And it's just great to have such partners. Thanks a million. So, hey, you realize it. I feel great satisfaction. And with this, I officially declare this podcast festival open. Have fun. I will disappear from the screen, but I will stay tuned in.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you for the kind words. And I very much agree with you that we have a lot of podcast stars tonight and for the rest of the festival. And I think this first speaker, and I'm so excited. I mean, as a podcast junkie myself, I'm so excited that we have this person with us tonight. And to be honest, he doesn't need any introductions, but I'll just want to tell you a very short story. So he basically 10 years ago, he was doing a PhD in history of science, and he has this favorite podcast show called Radiolab. He knew he wasn't going to have an academic career, so on a whim, he decided that he's gonna email his favorite podcast. And to his surprise, one of the producers at Radiolab actually replied to his email. And then they invited him for a phone call and to discuss some story ideas that he had. Unfortunately, they didn't like any of them. Then he kept pitching, and they didn't like the next batch of story ideas either. But he persevered and was very persistent. A little bit like me emailing him before this podcast festival and inviting him to be one of the speakers. Anyway, fast forward to 2014. He had one of his pitches accepted about a robot. And he finished grad school, and then he landed his dream job actually, and become a member of the Radiolab team. And then he became director of research. And if we fast forward again to September 2020, just a few months ago, Latif Nasser was promoted to become one of the hosts of Radiolab. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Latif tonight. Hello, Latif.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And actually, good morning. I'm so thrilled that you decided to have your morning coffee with us, because it's 8:38 in Los Angeles, and he got up early, especially for us. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be the kickoff to your wonderful festival. I'm so excited. The lineup looks so good. Both for the people that I know and even more so for the people that I don't. Really wonderful. So exciting. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. The pleasure is all ours. Just again, a few housekeeping things before we go on. If you have questions for Latif, please use the Q&A section in Zoom while we're talking. At the end of our conversation, we'll have time and we'll answer some of them. Well, he will answer some of them. Again, as director of research and before becoming a co-host of Radiolab, he had explored a variety of topics. But tonight, we'll talk about a mini-series that was broadcasted earlier this year. It's called The Other Latif, and it basically tells the story about this Moroccan man who ended up in Guantanamo Bay, this notorious prison. And he spent almost 20 years there. So we'll focus the conversation on that. Again, welcome, Latif. And well, I want to start with, so who is this other Latif?
Yeah, well, that's sort of the central mystery of the entire series, and that's also the kind of initial question that I had, that and kind of the engine of the reporting, the thing that kept me wanting to find out more. So the way it all started was I was on Twitter, and I saw somebody tweeting about me to the President of the United States, and I was like, that's weird. That doesn't make it. Why would this? And it was a law firm, and I was like, I've never even heard of, I don't really know anything about this. Like, and they were tweeting that like I ought to be released. And I was like, what are you talking about? And sort of the more I looked into it, I realized, first of all, the first thing that it took me a second to realize, because I'm a little slow, is that it was not about me. It was about another guy with my same name. And that this guy was currently at Guantanamo, and had been at Guantanamo basically since the beginning, since 2002. I just, like, all of a sudden, exactly the question you had: who is this guy? I needed to know everything about him. How is it that a guy with my name was at Guantanamo? Who was this guy? And I quickly found, kind of the first thing I found was this, when I Googled him, first my results came up, and I was like, oh, that's not good. But then I found this WikiLeaks DoD file about him that had kind of a rap sheet, a pretty serious list of charges of things that this guy had done. That he was Al-Qaeda's top explosives expert. He was an important advisor to Osama bin Laden. That he had personally helped destroy the Bamiyan Buddha statues, which are this UNESCO World Heritage Site. Just a very, very damning list of charges, which made me just think, oh wow, this man is sort of a monster. And then sort of soon thereafter, I got in touch with his lawyer, who told me basically the exact opposite, that he was never in Al-Qaeda. He did not know Osama bin Laden, or at least did not have a relationship with him. That he had been sold to the United States for a bounty, that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that that in fact, in addition to never having had formal charges or a trial, in fact, on the contrary, the United States government had unanimously agreed to release him in 2016, and then refused to do so. And so all of a sudden, like, I had these two stark portraits of this guy, and this sort of kind of like he was in this legal void. And there were just so few pieces of evidence about him, and they were all contradictory. And just again, it goes right back to your question, like, who was this guy? I needed to find out more.
Yeah, by the way, if you haven't listened to the miniseries, I advise you right after we finish with this first podcast evening to go and binge listen to it. But yeah, as you mentioned, this story was shrouded in mystery, and you wanted to know more. But at the same time, there was classified documents that you didn't have access to. Actually, one of his lawyers, Shelby, she keeps saying classified, classified, classified over and over again. And there were several obstacles for you finding more information. What kept you going? Didn't you discourage at some point to say, enough is enough? I can't figure out whether he's this evil person that the U.S. government is presenting, or he's innocent.
Yeah, it was extraordinarily frustrating. I mean, I as a journalist, I'm used to sort of digging. But mostly the kinds of stories I do are sort of science stories, where there are scientists who are sort of very willing to talk. They're not, in fact, the problem is they give you too much information. They say, oh, well, let me hedge this with that. And, but in this case, like, there were just drips and crumbs of this guy's life that I would find. And they would be, even when I would find them, even if I did find a way to get around this classified thing, I put in all of these, in the United States, we have these like freedom of information requests. So I would put these in, and you hear nothing, but I'm still waiting. They haven't come in. And so I would keep hitting this wall. My producers and I was working with some producers, Susie Lechtenberg, Sarah Kari, and we would keep hitting these walls. And they were very frustrating. And the thing that did make us keep going was it just felt so absurd. It felt like something medieval, where someone gets thrown in a prison cell and the door locked, and then you just don't really hear from them for 20 years. That's not something that should happen in the modern world, especially in a country that sort of so prizes justice and due process as the United States. The idea that the closest thing that this guy was getting to a trial was me and my fellow producers sort of just noodling around and trying to like find whatever information we could get. Like that just it felt so egregious. And then personally for me, so that was kind of in a sort of a, I don't know, these national ideals felt betrayed, and that was sort of in a big picture way. But in a small picture way, I just wanted to know, like, it was unsettling and eerie and creepy for somebody with my name to be in this place, Guantanamo, that is, I think for most Muslim Americans, like that's like really their worst nightmare. And for this guy to be there with my name, it sort of, in a way, it made me realize, oh, wait a second, like you could equally well be there. And if you were, you would want people to care and wonder how you got there and what you're doing there and why. And so given that we had that doubt, like I feel like I needed to find out more for myself. Like, how did this guy wind up there? And was it sort of proportional to something that he did, or was this kind of a government that just ran right over, just was sort of drunk with power and sort of just threw a guy away. And in a way, like both of those stories, there are examples of both of those stories kind of out there. And so it was kind of like, which story is this? Which kind of person is this guy? And and what should happen to this guy? Where should this guy be? What should, I mean, yeah, kind of just piecing through all of that. It was just too unsettling to leave on the table. I feel like we just kept coming back to it because we kept needing some kind of resolution. It was too unsettling,
You already mentioned Abdul Latif actually never got a trial, let alone a fair trial. Did it feel weird for you as a journalist to be in a position where you might be the person who knows best this case? Or even, I mean, at some point through one of his lawyers, he sends you a message saying, tell him to let his name out of Guantanamo. How do you feel knowing that this person is relying on you about decisions that are not in your area of expertise?
Yeah, it was so strange, and it kept getting, as we reported, it kept getting that level of strangeness and that level of pressure kept building in a way, like as we realized, oh, wait a second, he didn't get a trial, and the closest thing to a trial within the government system that he had, which was this kind of parole-like hearing called the PRB, he passed that. He won that. He basically got cleared through that process. So he had exhausted in a way his legal road. And I think for him, potentially, his law firm potentially, or some mix of them, I think they felt like because they didn't have the court of public opinion was sort of their next best thing. And the fact that I was one of the few, sometimes one of the, like maybe the only journalist who was interested in this guy. Like, I think it was like, all of a sudden it was like, oh, wow, okay, now this pressure, like, yeah, I think they felt that kind of pressure. And I was trying much more to be a sort of, you know, an objective journalist to say, or like a kind of a reasonably fair journalist to say, look, I don't actually know what this guy did. I'm not rooting for his, necessarily for his release, until I kind of see evidence that takes me there. But then the other thing was that I went to with my along with my producer Susie Lechtenberg, we went to visit his family in Morocco, and for them as well to put even more pressure on, to say, like, look, like we want our brother back, and to treat me because I had the same name, and not just that, I kind of to their eyes, I look like their brother. I'm his height, I'm his build, I was the age when they last saw him. There were all these things. When they saw me, just one of his sisters just started to weep, and they kind of started considering me their family. And for me, I was, you know, no story I'd ever done up until that point, and even still, have I been sort of kind of like personally implicated in that way, where I'm like, oh, it's, you know, this family saw me as one of them. And then for me to kind of keep trying to sort of report as honestly, as fairly as I can, while at the same time, like, this family considers me one of them, and they think that I'm their best shot at getting their brother back. That's like a lot of pressure. So yeah, so there was that pressure kind of to be the judge and the defense attorney and the you know, prosecuting attorney, and the jury, you know, all at the same time, like, and the pressure just got, you know, it kept ratcheting up.
Right, and just for the journalists in the audience, I just want to say you basically devoted 3 years of your life investigating the stories. As you mentioned, you went to Morocco to visit Abdul Latif's family. You went to Sudan, to the sunflower fields of Sudan, where he had worked allegedly for Osama bin Laden, etc. You visit Guantanamo Bay. That's a lot of hard work. But what was the most challenging part for you during those 3 years?
Well, let me say two quick things. One that Sudan, we actually didn't go to Sudan. But we had local journalists kind of doing some work in Sudan for us, which was very incredibly helpful. And they were really invaluable. Maki was his name. And then in addition, like, I also have to say, like for me to spend 3 years on a project is one thing, sort of in my own head, but also we had tremendous amount of support from our station to send us to all these places, to let us sit for that long with one story. Yeah, it was a tremendous amount of support that we got, and at the same time, kind of an editorial freedom to say, okay, we're going to pay for all this stuff, but you just do it however you want to do it. So we were very, very lucky in that respect. I think that's an immense luxury as a journalist to have that. Wait, repeat your question. Sorry.
What was the biggest challenge during the reporting phase, or even after?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge just constantly is, how do you build a 6-episode podcast, you know, effectively 6 hours, without the main character, never hearing the voice of the main character. I still have never heard his voice. And how do you do that? You know, you can't ask him questions. The only person you can ask about him is his lawyer, who is very, very guarded in what she can say. She's careful in what she wants to say and how she wants to portray him. So it was a really difficult thing to try to triangulate, like, here's this one, you know, very flattering story to him that makes him look like, you know, a totally innocent, even a noble, you know, aid worker type person. And then here's another picture of this guy who makes him look like a, you know, like a really malevolent, extremist. And then it's like, how do I, you know, in a normal interview, you sit down with the person and you say, okay, look, like, why did you do this? Well, like, this people see it this way. This people see it this way. What were you thinking at the time? Why would you have done that? But you can't do that at all. And so to have a whole, in a way, it was a creative challenge and a puzzle for all of us, for me and my colleagues at Radiolab who were building it, because it was like, yeah, like we had never done such a thing before. How do you build something so big around, you know, like it's all built on top of this one Jenga piece, and that Jenga piece isn't even there. So you're just like, how do we even do that? So it was a major challenge that was with us every step along the way.
Right. And so far we discussed the journalistic side and the reporting side of this story. But for me as a listener, it was interesting. Abdul Latif is not just your namesake. You don't just share this unique name. You also have similar family and religious backgrounds. I mean, you face similar personal dilemmas, for example, whether to choose between faith and education and what path for your future to go on. And as well as, you know, this story was unfolding at a time when the news were full of stories of Muslims being persecuted around the world. And of course, you watch this with anxiety. Did it teach you something about yourself? I mean, this whole like overlapping identity story.
Yeah, I think it really, like, in a way, actually, it's funny you mentioned that stuff, because in a way, a lot of that stuff we really tried to, my own personal stuff, we really tried to use it very purposefully to solve that challenge that I was just talking about, which is that if you have this kind of hole at the middle of the story of this guy that you can't talk to, what we figured out early on is, because of the name coincidence and because of these sort of life similarities, we could use my story to sort of make this guy, this abstraction of a guy, to make him more vivid and relatable and personal. And that was very helpful. So I had never gone personal in a way. I'd never talked about myself in any story that I'd done, you know, for the preceding 10 years. And then all of a sudden, this one, it was like I needed to use myself in a story, in a mechanical way, to literally be able to tell this story. And then as soon as I did, once that kind of barn door was open, like I started really projecting harder and harder, and imagining myself in this guy's shoes and him in my shoes, and imagining kind of I think it really makes you, for me at least, it really made me think about the kind of the level of agency we have in our own lives, you know, the decisions that we make and how much they're in our power, and how much they're sort of sculpted by forces that are bigger than us, that are of our moment, that are of our time. You know, the way, exactly as you say, the way that, like, growing up at this moment, to be a Muslim growing up at this moment, and actually I kind of feel the same way about this moment we're living in right now, but like, to open the newspaper and see, you know, stories of Bosnians and Afghanis, and, you know, or just, you know, today, like Rohingya and Uyghurs, and like, it's like you see these stories all over the news, and you think, wow, what is, you know, that it seems that really deeply shaped Abdul Latif Nasser's life. And in a different way, I think it really shaped mine growing up, kind of seeing all of that. And I think that there's, yeah, you just kind of, I feel like it's sort of reconceived my sense of where the kind of boundary is between my own personal agency and the kind of the really like turbulent, chaotic world all around us.
And I just want to follow up on that. I mean, you mentioned that you avoid the first person in storytelling, but at least to me, in this case, well, and also like getting personal, it's quite often controversial in journalism. But in this case, at least to me, I think you struck the perfect balance of telling us Abdul Latif's story and at the same time exploring these identity questions about your own life, without navel gazing like too much.
Right.
How do you, speaking about boundaries, how do you manage not to cross that fine line between the two?
You know, it's very funny because it was like tactical how we decided when to use certain parts of my story and not. And what we would always do is like, because we knew kind of in general the shape we were thinking, and in a way it basically followed that original WikiLeaks Department of Defense report that we found. It was like, you know, they had a kind of a story of his life, and it was saying, okay, there's a paragraph on Morocco, paragraph on Sudan, paragraph on Afghanistan. And so we, in a way, we sort of cribbed that structure because it just was a tidy structure and a clean one. And there were sort of charges in each of them and kind of interesting personal moments in each of them. And then what I tried to do is kind of like fill in like, oh, how does my story, what are the questions I most have about this guy? Like, why did he move there? Why would he have done this? Why wouldn't he have stayed with his family? What did it mean for him to go? What was he trying to do? Like to try to take those questions that I had for him, that sometimes I had evidence about from his family or from these reports or from his lawyer or wherever, and then piecing that together. And then like if you just did it like that, you could see just plainly in the storyboard, you know, in the structure, in the outlines, oh, this is extremely unsatisfying. It's really, there's not enough information here to feel like you're getting a full emotional portrait of a human being. And then it was those moments where you see those little holes, and it's like, oh, you know, that reminds me of a time when I was a kid, and my parents, or the time when you know, my dad was volunteering, or you know, this or that or the other thing, or when I was listening to the Red Hot Chili Peppers or whatever it was, right? And it's just like very much, I think, like we were very actively trying not to lead with me, but to lead with him, and then to help me kind of accent or shade in moments that felt especially kind of mysterious. And one of the other very helpful things was I would like stay up all night and I would write, you know, knowing the structure, I would like write a big long like essay about like, oh, this reminds me of this time when I was a kid and I was eating this thing and and then I would, in the morning, I would turn it over to my fellow reporters and producers, Sarah Kari and Susie Lechtenberg, and they would be like, and also my editors, Soren Wheeler and Jad Abumrad. They were quite savage. They would just cut stuff, and it was good, exactly for the reason you say. Like, you don't want it to be navel gazing. It's not a vanity project about me. This is a kind of, there is a person there, and even though we can't access him, you know, we like, that's a really important thing to remember. And my story is just helping us access him, as opposed to being kind of its own center of gravity, you know. And keeping that vision, and also having outside people who could keep that vision, and keep me honest in a way, that really helped us walk that line. Because I agree with you, there's a lot of stories that you hear and you're like, why are you talking about yourself? Like, just, yeah, I want to hear less about you, and I want to hear more about the story. And hopefully we tried to find that balance.
I think you did a good job, and plus, I think one of the morals here is it's important to have good editors, even when they make you kill your babies, as we say in journalism.
Exactly, I wholeheartedly agree.
Just to remind the audience, please send your questions to Latif in the Q&A section. We'll start in a bit with them. And just briefly, did you have a feeling at some point that you're losing yourself in the story, chasing the truth about Abdul Latif?
Yeah, there was one moment in particular that I can think of. We didn't even, I don't know why we didn't use this tape because it was good tape. I was interviewing a congressman, so like a pretty big, deal politically, a retired congressman, but he had been a congressman in the United States for a long time, and was head of, I think he was head of some very defense committee or something like that. But he, very esteemed, respected man. And he was basically part of there were very obscure, abstract, technical rules that I was trying to understand, because those were the technical rules that got this guy snarled after the US government had agreed to basically to release him home. There were these technicalities that he got stuck on, and then was the reason that he remained in Guantanamo. And I was trying to understand these technicalities. Why were they there? Were they sort of political moves? Were they about actually national security, as a lot of people alleged? Were they just, some people say that they weren't even political, they weren't even national security. It was just something vindictive that the Republican, politicians were trying to kind of get at President Obama at the time. So there were different things, and I was trying to get to this politician. I was trying to ask him, like, these technical rules about releasing Guantanamo detainees, like, why this rule? Why this rule? Why this rule? And I kept asking him, and I was sort of, I think, sort of badgering him. And he basically said, you're like, stop. Like, you have this guy's name. You have, like, you've lost yourself in him. I forget the exact phrase he used, but it was something like, you've lost yourself in him. You've lost your objectivity. You think you're this guy. This guy has your name, and you're getting carried away. And just like he basically scolded me. And it's funny because so I was alone doing the interview, but my producer Susie was on the line as well, and afterwards I was shaken because I was like scolded by this older, very dignified politician, and my producer was like, he, like, I hate to tell you, but like, he was kind of right. Like, in that moment, I did sort of go over the line. There was a moment where I sort of lost myself in it, and I was like, oh. And what I tried to do in this series was kind of, although to be fair and to present, like, and which we did, all of the most damning evidence, everything we found, really, kind of warts and all, but at the same time, kind of be clear and open-hearted in the way that I was pulling for this guy to be innocent, and even though that, it was more complicated than I ever could have imagined or hoped, and it was, that I found evidence that was quite damning, sort of, and independent of the U.S. government. I was still pulling the whole time for him to be innocent. And I think there were times where I sort of lost myself, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that was too far, and I need to kind of check myself and remind myself, like, what I'm actually trying to do here, and that how important it is to be fair, and I'm not his lawyer, and I really, that's very important that I'm not his lawyer.
And speaking of government, and me being born and raised in a part of the world where corruption or rule of law is a big issue, and we also, let's say, the United States is presented as this liberal country where democracy is flourishing, etc., etc. And you, while reporting on this story, you are amidst applying for U.S. citizenship. I don't know if many of our attendees know, but you're Canadian. So given this lack of a trial, you mentioned earlier maybe having a government drunk on power and sending somebody to prison on a technicality, or not releasing him for that reason. What does this story tell us about America, like, now? Yeah,
I feel like I was so, because I was becoming a citizen. My wife was born in the United States. Both my kids who were born here and are citizens. So I was like, oh, I guess I need to become a citizen. And sort of as I was thinking about that, going through that, and I wanted to become a citizen for a long time because I believe in a lot of the kind of bedrock American ideals. And it's funny, like you say that, it's so right. Like I feel like this country is such a, I mean, it just constantly sort of punches you in the face with it, with how paradoxical and opposite it is. You know, it's like, this is the country where, you know, just in the last few days, like they announced that there are 2 very promising COVID vaccines, but it's also and here, like that's where they're doing the research. And then also here are people who don't wear masks and say that it doesn't exist say that COVID doesn't exist as they're like gulping for air in the ICU. Like this country contains both. It contains, you know, a regime that is separating children and putting them in cages at the border, and then it also includes, you know, the Broadway musical Hamilton, you know, where immigrants get the job done, and it's like the cast of the Founding Fathers in this multiracial, team. It just is such a paradox, and this is kind of, it seems like really one of them, you know, where it's this moment where the United States does hold itself, and I think in times, sometimes admirably, to giving due process, to making sure everybody gets a fair trial. That's a very, very important. That's kind of the cornerstone, not just of the United States, of modern countries. And for the United States to take that so seriously, that's good and right. And then also for this country to be a place where there is effectively a prison that they created in a place off the map, where in particular where laws don't apply, and where they can send people and let them kind of rot basically for 20 years. Like that's the same country. It's so complicated, but that's this country, you know, and I think that signing up for it, for me, I think I was trying to sign up for not the best, not the worst, that things that are actually happening, but the ideals, you know, like the ideals that this man should get a trial, and that even though he is locked away, that there are people working feverishly to basically smush the Constitution in the face of anybody who is arguing to keep this guy there, and to keep him in that, and the 39 other guys in this legal limbo. And I hope that they close down Guantanamo. I do. But yeah, I don't know. It shouldn't have been started in the first place, but I hope they do close it. And I do think that there is something about those ideals. There's a sort of a power and a muscularity to them, and an insistence and an ability to shout it out with the First Amendment that makes this country special and worth kind of being a part of. I don't know. Sorry for rambling a little while there.
No, it was quite interesting, and there is a lot to outline with those paradoxes in place.
It's just I see it everywhere. The paradoxes of this country. You couldn't sort of turn the contrasts up any higher, you know.
And yeah, I mean, given the recent election, trust us, we can all see it while we're obsessively refreshing our browsers before the election results. But actually, for Abdul Latif, this past election, something very important might be different and important might be at stake. It might be his freedom. Do you think that now there will be a new administration? Do you think he'll be released?
I think it is promising. I think it is, well, certainly compared to had there been a second Trump administration, that the likelihood would have been zero. Now with President-elect Biden, there's definitely a chance. And to be fair, I mean, the last crack he had during the Obama-Biden administration, they still didn't manage to get close Guantanamo as they promised. They didn't manage to get even a guy like Abdul Latif Nasser, whom they had cleared to be sent home. They still didn't get him out. So it's not a sure thing. I imagine, just knowing the political realities, freeing a prisoner who can't vote and whom a majority of the country believes to be a evil terrorist in some way responsible for 9/11, despite the fact that he wasn't. I think that's not a political there's a lot of political capital that it may take to do that. And while he was campaigning, President-elect Biden said that he reaffirmed, which surprised me and kind of some of the people I talked to, that he would have said that he still wants to close Guantanamo. So there seems to be will there, but there are a lot of potentially, like, to close Guantanamo, there are a lot of political hurdles. It seems to be to release Abdul Latif Nasser. It actually does not require the cooperation of Congress or any other. I mean, I guess they would have to. I'm not sure the technicals about it. I'm actually very soon going to talk to this week. I'm going to talk to all of the folks basically we interviewed in the story to be like, what do you think is about to happen? But I do think the chances are existent, and I might even say good, that he will be returned to Morocco.
I spy maybe a follow-up episode, maybe.
Yes.
Sometime.
Oh, definitely. I've told both my family and my Radiolab team that if and when this guy gets released, I'm going to be on the first plane to Casablanca to greet him on the other side and to finally do that interview that I feel like I've been waiting for 4 years now.
Or just actually, I have a zillion more questions, of course, but and this was one of them. And I think there is one question from the audience on that. During the ministers, you also say that you were fantasizing of interviewing him. What would you ask him? How would you imagine this meeting unfolding?
I just would want I feel like I've talked about him for 6 hours. I think I'd want to shut up and I'd say, just tell me your story. Tell me your story from the beginning. Just tell it to me as you remember it, as you lived it. Why did you move to so many places? What were you doing in Afghanistan? How has the last 20 years, what is your experience like being at Guantanamo? What do you think about the United States? What do you, what do you want to do next? I think I am kind of, I feel like, and partly because of the name thing, but also partly now because of all this reporting that I've done, I'm kind of invested in this person, and I want to know more about him, and kind of in the richly complex way that I'm sure is going to buck all of my assumptions, and I'm sure I got some things wrong, and I'm sure it's going to be a much more kind of complicated and nuanced story that's not going to be what his lawyer said, that's not going to be what the government said. I'm sure it's going to be some kind of something I probably didn't even imagine, and so I just want to shut up, and I just want to let him tell his story and to hear what actually happened. I mean, certainly, he might be spinning me this way or another, but just to hear his story and to kind of see him, look him in the face as he tells it, I think that'll be very valuable, and I think hopefully it will satisfy a lot of the curiosity that I have.
Yeah, oftentimes, that's why nonfiction is much more interesting than fiction, because you cannot imitate life, basically.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you some of the questions that audience members send us. So Desislava
Please.
Milkova is asking, do you think living the story with all the challenges to objectivity makes reporting better? And did that impose an even higher responsibility on your work?
Yeah, I think it does, in the way that sort of being so personal, I feel like you're on the line in a much more extreme way. Like to use like, for me to start and say, this is a story about my name, and this is a story about, it's about this guy, but I'm going to use myself to help you learn about this guy. In a way, what I'm sort of saying in saying that is that if 20 other expert, perhaps even more expert than me, journalists were to do this story, they would do it differently. Like, I'm going to do this story very differently than anybody else would. And in that way, you're kind of putting yourself sort of out on a limb in a different way. You are kind of responsible in a different way. And to me, that, I mean, it's not that, like, I still do the same amount of fact checking, and I try to be as rigorous about sourcing and things like that as I can, and as I would be on any other story. But it does seem like there's a piece of a much bigger piece of me that's kind of on the table, and a much bigger piece of me that, where and in a way, because part of the engine of the show and the idea of the series is to ask the listeners to sort of make their own judgments and come to their, but in a way, it's not just him that they're going to be judging, they're going to be judging me too, in a way, based by virtue of the fact that I'm putting myself out there. So yeah, it just brings up a whole other set of questions for the listener and for me, some other sensitivities. It was very difficult. Whether it makes the sort of final product better, I think in this case it does. To say it in a blanket way, I'm not totally sure. I feel like it really depends on the kind of reporting you do, but I do think that it gives it a kind of authenticity, and it gives it a kind of earnest and honestness that makes me want to listen to it more. Like, I feel like that's when I find stories like that, or series like that, or episodes like that of any show, like those are the times when I want to listen more, when you feel like the person telling you the story has something riding on it, where there's something, sort of some piece of their heart that is in that story. It really makes it more engrossing. I don't know if it makes it better journalism or not. I think that's a kind of an open question and sort of a touchy-feely kind of question. But to me, it certainly makes it more listenable.
Thank you. And the next question from Peter Georgiev is, you always seem so excited about every idea and story you pitch or report. How do you keep your enthusiasm as a journalist to find and explore new issues and topics?
I get so excited. I'm not sure. It's funny. I do think that enthusiasm for me is a very good, I just try to be I try to listen hard to myself, whether I'm actually excited about something or not. And then I try to clear all the stuff I'm not actually excited to off the table entirely. And I try to just, put stories on the table, pluck only the flowers that I think that smell nice and that will keep me mesmerized, and it's like that to me, I don't know, it's just like asking yourself continually and very brutally honestly, am I still interested in this story or not? Is this interesting or not? I've seen 100 stories like this. Why is this one interesting, whereas the other ones are not? What is this one teaching me? What is this one? What is the thing that what is the assumption that I had my whole life that is just totally being upturned by this story? What is the thing that I cannot believe I did not know? I'm 35 years old. For 35 years, I did not know this thing until now. How is that possible? It's kind of that feeling. Like I feel like it's like those are the things that I get excited about, and then I kind of apply those questions pretty rigorously and pretty constantly to the stories that I have, and so I sort of sift out the stuff I'm not actually excited about, and then when I do have something I'm excited about, I give myself to it, and I just let it take me wherever it will until my sort of enthusiasm fuel runs out. Then I'm like, then I toss it aside. But as long as you're kind of it's a kind of love. Like you fall in love with a story, and you have to kind of chase it. And it doesn't mean that it's a beautiful, happy story, or it's a like it could be a story like this. That's it's a horrible, tragic story. It's a complicated story. It's a messy story. But even then, it's like find the things that you think are not obvious, the things that you and try to kind of remember that feeling when you first heard this story, and how the notes it played in you, and kind of keep that and use that. Another really good trick, like this is a good trick I tell to other journalists who, especially if you're doing kind of long form stories, it's hard to keep that enthusiasm up as you have a story over like, and even not if you're doing it over 3 years, but a trick I would use, which I guess is much harder now in the age of COVID, but a trick I would use is go outside, meet a stranger. It could be like in line at the grocery store or whatever. Or it could be a friend that you just haven't talked to in a long time and have never told about this story, and tell them this story that you're working on, that you're excited about, and watch their eyes like light up or not light up, or, just you kind of demo it in a way for somebody. And when you do that, what you'll notice is you'll hear the story afresh through that person's ears. And the things that person is getting excited about, the questions they have will help you, but then also the excitement that they have will also help you. And if it's blowing their mind the same way that it blew your mind when you first heard about it, that's like the easiest way to get a hit of that, memory of, oh yeah, I forgot that was so surprising, because now I've been sitting with this story for so long, but that was actually really surprising. How could that possibly be? And then, and then you can and then it makes it much easier to kind of ride that wave of enthusiasm, because you just got that sort of booster. Mixing metaphors. You got that booster shot from the stranger, or from your friend. So it's just like constantly getting at strategic intervals, like a new burst of clear eyes or fresh energy, that you can like a vampire, you can sort of suck it a little bit and then use that as your fuel to keep going. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have 2 minutes left, but maybe a short answer to this last question from Teodora Barzakova. She wants to know whether podcasts give freedom to journalists to express their opinions more freely, be it Guantanamo or other politics or whatever the issue is, compared to other formats or other like forms of reporting.
I think every medium has its own freedoms and limitations and ways that it locks you in. For me, I think podcasts, there are a number of things. One is space. It gives you, like, you can make things as many episodes as you want. You can go on for as long as you want. You can trim things here or there, like that space. You're not hitting exact broadcast clock. You don't need a commercial break at exactly the same place. Like that's a really liberating kind of a thing. Another really liberating thing, I think, is that you can't see the people. So unlike documentary film, I think so often our eyes are so judgy. Our eyes are so judgmental, and hearing somebody, I think there's a tremendous amount of freedom that you gain of the listener's sort of empathy in a way, like where you're like, I can make you care about someone who, if you just saw on the street, you might not care about. Whereas if you hear them through your own, like reverberating through your own skull, you actually will care about them in a totally different way. So I think in those ways in particular, those are kind of the two biggest ones, I think, where it's like, there is a tremendous amount of freedom there. Like those two things, they can unlock things that in a lot of other mediums, in a lot of other kind of formats, are a lot harder to crack.
I agree. I mean, that's why I find myself sometimes walking on the street crying or laughing out loud, depending on what kind of podcast I'm listening to. Latif, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us. It was very interesting. Of course, I wish I could keep asking you questions, but I know that
Thank you.
you have.
And to everybody in the audience, if you as I saw that there were more questions that I wasn't able to answer, please feel free to email me. My email address is on my website. Please get in touch. I think this is such a wonderful medium, and I just want to encourage everybody who's just getting into it to really give it a shot, because it's a wonderful, beautiful thing, and and I think there's so much exciting work. It's a golden age. There's so much exciting work going on right now, and I'm so excited about this festival that's showcasing so much of it.
Thank you so much. And your stories has been an inspiration for many, I'm sure. Plus, if you haven't, I think you should read Latif's post about how to find story ideas. It's great, especially for podcast newbies or people who want to start or improve their own podcast. So that's great. Latif, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I hope someday we'll have a chance to welcome you in Sofia in person continue this conversation.
Yeah, please. I cannot wait. I'm counting the days. So invite me next year or whenever, and I'll be there.
Oh, be careful. I might take you up on that offer. So expect more emails from me. But I do hope to meet one day in person. In the meantime, we will keep listening to Radiolab stories. Thank you so much. For the audience, don't go anywhere. We'll have a 10-minute break just so we allow the next batch of amazing speakers to join us. We'll have a very interesting discussion with a colleague of Latif, actually. Tracy Hunt will be here with us, rough translation, Gregory Warner, and Anna Boagova, who started one of the first narrative podcasts in Bulgaria. Stay tuned. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Again, don't go anywhere. And Latif, again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. What a lineup. All right.
Bye.
Is this working?
It is, but the audience can hear you, so we'll be back in like 5 minutes. welcome back. Now we'll continue with the next panel discussion. For those of you joining us now, welcome to Bulgaria's first podcast festival. We were very excited to have Latif Nasser talk to us about his latest mini-series called The Other Latif. And now I'm thrilled to welcome the next panelist as part of this festival. What a fascinating story it was, this of The Other Latif. And now we'll continue talking about how to tell captivating stories with three amazing speakers. We actually have Tracy Hunt, who is a colleague of Latif at Radiolab. Hello, Tracy. Thanks for joining us. We also have Gregory Warner, who is the host and creator of Rough Translation. Welcome, Gregory.
Thanks.
And we have Anna Blagova, who is one of the creators and a co-host of the Urban Detective, the first narrative podcast in Bulgaria. Hello, Anna.
Hi.
And of course, each of you can go online and read their bios. I don't think they need any introduction. That's why I want to briefly tell you about their work or about them through one story that I, as a listener, for example, stayed with me. Recently, it was in June, Rough Translation aired a story called Hotel Corona. And as the pandemic kept raging around us and around the world, it was this very heartwarming story about a hotel which brings together Jews and Arabs, religious and secular, and have them share meals, laughs, sometimes coughs, selfies, Zumba moves. They were all recovering COVID-19 patients, and while the hotel is no longer working, it helped forge unlike bonds and friendship. And really, when I listened to this story in May, it was the reprieve basically that I needed in the midst of this bizarre times. And when it comes to Tracy, Radiolab recently had an episode called Nina, where she explored the famous singer Nina Simone's civil rights legacy. And basically, she heard a song. It was a performance from 1968, following the murder of Martin Luther King and the protest. And it turned into a story about the then ongoing protests against systematic racism in the United States. And when it comes to Urban Detective, which explores a different topic related to urban life, one of my favorite episodes, it's called The Sea of Sofia, and it actually tells the story of how the Communist Party in Bulgaria back in the day had this grand architecture plan to build an artificial sea around the capital of Bulgaria, Sofia. So there you have it. If you haven't listened to those episodes, I highly recommend them. And now, just before starting with the questions, as we did with the previous session, towards the end of the discussion, we'll have time for audience questions. So feel free to ask away in the Q&A section of this webinar. For those of you who need translation, please click on the interpretation on your Zoom menu and click the Bulgarian channel. Well, I'm so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And obviously, a compelling story can keep us on edge for hours on end. And I want to start with Tracy. So Latif told us about the miniseries, but in general, what constitutes a good Radiolab story?
Yeah, so I think what constitutes a good Radiolab story is that we kind of want the listener to almost go on a journey with the characters, where you are starting out in one place, and then by somewhere in the middle of the story, you kind of change your mind about the situation, and then by the end, you change your mind again. And then when it's all done, you're not really sure how to feel about about the story you just heard. And so I think like a really good example of that is, I think a really classic example of that is our reporter Simon Adler did a piece a few years ago about rhino hunting, that, you know, an American's going over to Namibia to hunt rare Black rhinos. And then you kind of, by the end of it, you learn about how, you know, the rhino, by doing this, they're able to raise, the government of Namibia is able to like kind of raise enough money to help preserve these Black rhinos, but it's done through hunting. And so you're just like morally conflicted about how you feel about this situation. And so I think that's kind of like the classic Radiolab story. You know, I think one of the biggest stories I did for Radiolab was with Latif, actually, was a border trilogy, where we investigated what happens, you know, how is it that so many migrants die trying to get into the US? And the fact that that number had exploded sometime in the 1990s, whereas it used to just be like, you know, maybe a dozen people died in the desert, to now we have up to 100, up to 1,000 sometimes dying in the desert trying to get into the US. And so what happened? What about the US policy that changed? And kind of like trying to go back into that history and peel back all these layers to figure out how we got here. And so I think like, you know, Radiolab over the years, we become more of a how did we get here kind of podcast. Especially now in the US when there's so much, you know, stuff going on in the US. We've been spending a lot more time trying to figure out like, what is it about our history that can tell us about how we got here and how we can potentially fix it. So I think that's where we are right now.
Thank you. I do remember the border trilogy story, and I'll come back to it a little bit later in the discussion. So Gregory, I mean, rough translation brings stories from faraway places to the United States. What's the thing that you're looking for in a story?
Well, and first, thanks for inviting me here. It's great to come after Tracy, because I feel like so much of what I learned about podcasting really came from working on Radiolab stories. So that idea of taking a journey with a character is definitely the same kind of language we use over at Rough Translation. I would say that one thing that we're often looking for is how does this, it's a story of somebody kind of coming up against the rules of a place or the cultural rules of a place, and either learning something about those rules, about themselves, and we through that often kind of have a perspective shift or a change of assumptions, because sometimes the rules of a place make us think differently about the rules that are sort of invisible to us. You know, an example of that, I suppose, just more recently, we just did a series called School of Scandal, which we called School of Scandal, which were 3 episodes that that were around the world. One was about caste discrimination in the US. So an Indian social order, or South Asian social order, I should say, that was then imported to Silicon Valley and was kind of coming under the radar of a lot of the ways we talk about discrimination or bias in the US, because it's like an invisible code if you're not of that culture. And in fact, even for some 2nd and 3rd generation Indians in the US, it's invisible to them. And yet it was having such a huge effect on who was hired and who's not. And another kind of example is from that same series, Stella Nyanzi, who's a Ugandan activist, saying all kinds of extremely scandalous and spectacularly vulgar things about the president. It was a strongman president. It sort of makes you think, well, wait, why in an incredibly conservative African country, very Christian country, would this person be a kind of popular hero? And it looks at sort of what rules she's taking advantage of, which are pre-Christian traditions. And so, yeah, so sometimes people activating those traditions to help them, other times bumping up against them and having quite a few obstacles as a result.
Thank you. And Anna, narrative podcasting is relatively little known genre in Bulgaria. What made you decide to start a narrative podcast?
Well, first, I also want to thank you for the invitation and for giving me the chance and my co-hosts, who are not here right now, to be on a virtual stage with some of our most favorite podcasts. And the answer to your question is that we were really not very concerned with the fact that they weren't popular, or maybe actually we were, but we were just huge fans of Radiolab. And we were like, wouldn't it be great if there was something like that in Bulgaria? And then we just had to try and do something. This was the reason.
And do you think there is interest for such genre in the country?
I think it's developing. It's definitely developing. It would be great if more of the public media and national media got into developing this genre, because I think it's a genre that needs a lot of backup and it needs a lot of funding to be developed. But to be completely honest, when we started, which was 2 years ago, there weren't so many Bulgarian podcasts in any genre at all. So I just think that this revolution that everyone is talking about maybe is about to come here a bit late.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's why we're doing the podcast festival. We see some momentum happening, and we want to bring extra inspiration. And actually, yeah, it's so fascinating actually to connect the voices to the faces, because usually I'm headphones on and have enjoyed the narrative rather than imagining the person behind it. Each of you mentioned some of the episodes and some of the topics that you've already explored. So how do you find story ideas? I mean, those kind of story ideas that bring you to the journey that Tracy and Gregory already mentioned.
I'll go first because I feel like I have the shortest answer. I'm really bad at finding story ideas. I'm really bad at it. Especially because at Radiolab, like we really try hard to find, that kind of character, that story that's going to give you the character arc that we look for in our show. And as a matter of fact, the Border trilogy, like that was Latif's story idea that I just sort of attached myself to, and because we work really well together. And a couple of my other stories, I found ideas on Twitter when I see people on Twitter talking about things I'm really interested in. I try to follow my own natural curiosity. I try to, a nice thing about working for a public media company is that you get sent lots of books. And so that can be really helpful. But yeah, I'm really bad at it. So I'm excited to hear how other people find other story ideas.
Okay, I didn't expect that answer. So just a quick follow-up on that. Would you say that brainstorming is like a collective process at Radiolab?
No, not really. Sometimes, so with our insomnia line kind of episode was a little bit of a brainstorming idea. I had the, for a long time, I work in podcasting, but I love live radio. And for a long time, I've been like, wow, it would be so cool if Radiolab had like a live call-in show or something. About that, and then the quarantine started. We'd all been having so much trouble sleeping. A couple of us have talked about, like, you know, how we call each other. So it just kind of like was one of those things that bubbled out to like call, you know, and that's not like kind of like, it was one that definitely came from different parts of the team to like come together, where we all just like a couple of us decided to stay up all night, come, you know, make a Google Voice number and then just get people to call us and interview them on the radio. Not live though, but I would have liked it if it was a live show even more, I think. But that kind of aesthetic, that feel, and it turned out to be really, really great. But yeah, that's so. But a lot of our story ideas are, you know, like maybe if I have an idea, I go to one of my, you know, colleagues and ask for help, or come up with people to talk, you know, come up with like a list of people to talk to, sources that we have. But for the most part, our story ideas are kind of like individual. We come up with them by ourselves. Yeah, not really brainstorming.
Yeah, that was an awesome episode. So Gregory, do you have tips for us and maybe for Tracy, or how do you search for your story ideas?
I mean, yeah, just to mention on the insomnia episode, which was so good. It's also, what was so good about it was that the old model of a radio story doesn't then become the prison of the future. It doesn't lock you into a particular way of telling a story, but rather you use techniques of storytelling and try a new format. So that can often be a limitation I find in the team in terms of brainstorming, because we're maybe stuck on a particular way. But no, I would say I personally wrote myself into a box when I was pitching this show, because I remember in many times would say, listen, we're not going to do kinds of stories that, and this didn't mean to in a bad way, but we're not going to do the kinds of stories you would brainstorm in New York or Washington, D.C. Like, we're not going to think of something that we're curious about and then follow that. We're going to find out about something and realize we should be curious about it. So kind of reversing that. Unfortunately, that was pitched when I was overseas, and now I'm in New York. But the fortunate thing is that we have 17 NPR international correspondents, and we meet with them now on Zoom every 2 weeks to basically collectively brainstorm with them and what they're seeing on their beats. So that's amazingly helpful. And then in addition to that, people in different parts of the world who are pitching us stuff, there is some degree of kind of, okay, what if we could be curious about this and following that? But I mean, that's harder. It's harder for us because it, you know, you start with where you are, and then you have to somehow make this leap to someplace you didn't know to go.
Yeah, tell me about it. As a journalist myself who is pitching stories from, let's say, a little-known country in Eastern Europe, sometimes it's hard to convince editors that this is worth reporting, etc. So do you bring, let's say, local reporters into the brainstorming session, or they pitch you separately and then you decide which stories to develop?
I mean, it's both, but I'm glad you mentioned that about what's worth reporting, because and it's always a kind of mental exercise that you're constantly schooling yourself on. But to me, I mean, people have pitched us stories that they said, oh, wow, I pitched other places, but they weren't interested because it wasn't important or didn't register. But then we do the story and people get really into the episode and it's popular. It's so I feel like, in some sense, what I like to be able to do and what I try to do is to understand what I should be curious about. Like, it's not what I am curious about now sitting in my chair, but if I only take this journey, I'm going to be completely curious about it. And the kind of fun thing about working with freelancers and correspondents who are based in a place is not only that they have access to stories, but that they're sort of filtering it through a certain level of knowledge. So like, no, but this thing happening in Afghanistan, whatever is, no, but this is really interesting. And it doesn't fit with the Afghanistan conversation that say we're having. But so it's that extra work of figuring out why you should be curious, which often then is some radio trick, like using a character, using a kind of a journey of a story or the reporter's journey to get us to that place that then we can start looking around with that person.
Right. Yeah, you had an episode about a missing photojournalist in Iraq that stuck with me, and I still remember it very vividly. And it shows how important is the work of local reporters and to have people in the field. And I think we'll get back to it a bit later.
Yeah.
So Anna, how did you choose to focus on architecture, cities around Bulgaria, and what were you thinking behind the episodes that you've produced so far?
So originally, the idea of the show was to investigate or interrogate myths and urban legends, not in the sense of true crime or such urban legends, but things that people repeat and say. For example, you get into a taxi and the driver starts telling you how, there's a network of underground tunnels in Sofia which connect so and so such and such place, and that the deputies from the parliament can escape to the mountains. So the idea was to focus around such funny folklore that all of us have heard, and through it, of course, investigate it. But the idea was to try to tell a larger story about how the city developed, tell a lot of stories around it. Of course, there are a number of popular myths like this that you can investigate. So we've also, as we made the second and the third season, moved to history. And looking back at history, I find a lot of inspiration in archival photos and in archives. For example, a photo of the old airship over one of our famous churches was really interesting for me. And I was just as Latif said, how come I didn't know that? I'm 35 and I didn't know that. So this became an episode about Bulgarian avant-garde artists, which somehow got connected to this idea. So all kinds of ways stories come.
True. Okay, so let's assume you find the perfect pitch, you start reporting. How do you produce a story so you can seduce the audience to pay attention and to stick with it? I know it's a hard question. Maybe start with Gregory this time.
Well, I like that you use the word seduce. I mean, I don't know how common that is in journalism to think about the seduction process, but it does feel like if you're starting with a story that doesn't have necessarily like news importance, and it's not short, you're telling people to come on a ride with you. Yeah, I mean, it's like any act of entertainment. I mean, you want to get people involved. There's not like a general rule about it. I mean, I can think of any number of stories we've started, but like using, techniques from, This American Life or Radiolab or 99% Invisible. I mean, a lot of people, I think, use similar techniques and of either starting with character or starting with a question, which is quite important. I find that in working with reporters, they're often giving us a lot of interesting material, but then really drilling down and figuring out what the question they're trying to ask gives a kind of momentum. Because if you can ask a compelling enough question, then people might stick around for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tracy.
I think that question is so important. And that's also like a part of it that I sometimes struggle with as a reporter, because I find that I'm just sort of, the way I report is that I try to talk to everyone involved in the thing, whatever the thing is that happens. And then sometimes now trying to drill in okay, but what am I really trying to focus on can be a little difficult, because I feel like I have so many voices in my head. But yes, I feel like figuring out that question is so important. At Radiolab, we often try to figure out that question just like in the writing the pitch. We ask a question to all our pitchers, whether they're internal or, we're working with freelancers, like, what about this is interesting to you? What's your big question that you have? Because we definitely feel that the listener, if the reporter is excited and really into something, the listener will get there too as well. So it doesn't really matter if the thing isn't really that newsy, or if the thing is about this, about square dancing or something, if we can just sort of make the, if we can hear the excitement in the journey of reporting it, that will bring, the listener along. And then there's other, kind of just classic radio things of really good writing and really good, sound design, that's really important. And that will also hook people. We try at Radiolab to make things really cinematic. And we kind of use a lot of movie documentary type things. I remember I follow this reporter on Twitter, and she kind of said something that I hadn't really thought about, where she was like, yeah, in journalism and when you learn to write for a newspaper, you put all the important information up top, and then the rest of the story gets that classic inverted pyramid style. But radio stories, they just start at the beginning. And it's the important stuff that you want to get doesn't really happen till 30, 40 minutes into the piece or something. And that's how we, and so in that way, but we do that because we want to bring you along, the reason why somebody may read a story in a newspaper versus listening to it on the radio is because they want to be brought along on a journey. And so we just kind of make that journey as fun as possible and as interesting. So yeah.
Well, following up on that, exactly. I mean, in J school or just journalism 101, we were taught that, each narrative has a structure, there should be a conflict that the protagonist is experiencing, and then we're introduced to a resolution. But what is the key to making those stories, as you say, to bring along the listener and make them really intellectually and emotionally engaging for the people, who listen?
I guess making sure that the story has those things to begin with, that it does have conflict and tension and so on. Oh boy, I don't know the answer. Gregory or Anna?
I would just say that those things are so hard. You say well, yeah, we know about those things, but actually to get intention and conflict and resolution in real life is so hard, I think. So if you have that, you're really 87% there.
Yeah.
And yeah, also what Tracy said about putting the important stuff start at the beginning. That is true. And it's so, it's so hard to do. Even in the story that we were structuring this morning, and I was thinking about this, there's a reason that this person we're going to introduce you to is actually, she changed war. I mean, she's so important, but should we reveal that right in the beginning or later? And I was kind of wondering about that in the sense that it would maybe help engage you, but maybe it's the thing that you're going to want to hit in the first turn. So I mean, it's not an easy rule to follow. I don't find it an easy rule to follow by any means.
Yeah, I mean, another. I just thought of another word that we use a lot at Radiolab, and I'm forgetting here, and that is also maybe not helpful, but surprise is is another big part of that. And you know, and I mean, and I guess, Gregory, what you're talking about with, you know, you're trying to hold back a character you're thinking about, and maybe this person is supposed to be some sort of surprise, and so you're trying to figure out like where to put this surprise, you know, like that sort of stuff is like really, can be really, really tricky. And you know, I'm working on a story right now that kind of that covers a little bit of the 80s. And so this is all stuff that happened 30 years ago. And this is also a story that, that I think people probably think that they're very familiar with. You know, and so the surprise element, the tension element, the conflicts, all those things are a little trickier because some, you know, because they're kind of recent history, or like, you know, very YouTubeable, you know, like if you want to see what you know, like this ACT UP was doing in the 80s or in the 80s and 90s, you just have to Google it and you'll find a million videos about it. And so that's been really tricky, is trying to find out how to introduce like things like conflict and tension, that, you know, to a very old, well-told story, but in like in a new way that also revealed something unexpected. And so, and I mean, and I think I found that in my reporting, but now it's just a question of presenting it in a way that that listeners will respond to and will make them, you know, I'm really worried that they're going to start listening to it and be like, oh, I know this story already, and then not listen to it anymore. And so the beginning of our piece is now is way more important than I think in usual, because it's like, we really have to hook people. And, you know, and one way that we're thinking about doing it is like, so one of my characters, his lover died of AIDS, and he has this really beautiful love story about him. And so we think we're going to start with that love story and make it just really, really gorgeous, because whereas that's a familiar story to a lot of people, you know, young gay man in the 90s whose lover died at too young an age is sort of like a familiar story at this point. We think that the individual details of that story can be the thing that draws our listeners in. So that's how we're going to approach it. Who knows? Maybe we'll change it 8 more times before it comes out. But that's like that's like the thing we're trying right now. And so I guess like for this type of story, the details, the reporting it's going to be like really important. I mean, it's always important, but it's going to be what distinguishes it from other like stories like this. Yeah.
So once you find that surprise moment, you know that maybe you have it. Gregory, do you have this kind of aha moment during a reporting or producing a story where you know that it's going to be a good yarn, or until the very last moment you're still wondering? I mean, as you mentioned, just nailing down the structure, or like following this tried and true rules of you know, constructing a story.
Yeah, I mean, those aha moments are one of the reasons that I still wake up in the morning. It's like one of the greatest feelings is to be interviewing somebody and feeling like you're giving something new about that person, or helping see them in a way that they wouldn't have been seen. It's like but no, I think that one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities, or whatever you can say, is that the audience is fairly smart about all this stuff, you know, and I feel like there were techniques that we could have used a few years ago to set up surprise that don't. Maybe some of them still work. I mean, there are techniques that have been used in novels written hundreds of years ago that still work. So it's kind of art is art, but I do think that if you start. There's ways in which, you know, if you start a story in a certain way, people do know then the traditions of the narrative journalism and surprise, especially because yeah, the surprise is like the first thing that people learn to recognize, and it doesn't mean that it can't still be enjoyable, but I do find that just saving information for later, because you then reveal it, can actually backfire. You know, people are like, well, wait, if you had told me that, I mean, you know, and so, and you know, I've argued in that way with podcasts myself. So it's really hard to know in any one moment, sort of, you may have a aha moment, but that was like many, many months ago, and you no longer have the aha moment to guide you. And so you just have to figure out, you know, where it would go. But yeah, so it's not easy. I guess it's the sum of what I'm saying.
For sure. And what's the role of like finding the right protagonist or character in this regard? I mean, when, let's say, the surprise or the aha moment is gone, to like help you shape the narrative and the story you're telling.
So, I mean, just, yeah, I'll just make a short answer, but I think, of course, I mean, obviously it's extremely important, but I would say that one of the things we do try to do, because we're an international show, is not make characters have to have a kind of sense of transformation or a realization themselves. I love those moments when they happen, but you know, that kind of comes out of reporting that I've done overseas, where people are not as, I mean, you know, I don't want to speak generally about the world, but I've reported in places where certainly people are not sort of speaking in a kind of self-aware American tradition, where you know not only what you feel about something, but why you feel that way, and why your parents maybe made you feel that way, and a kind of a psychoanalytic kind of sensibility. So people are like, yeah, they don't sometimes go further than that in the tape. And then I feel like it's our job to figure out why, and sort of try to understand enough about the place, or about the rules of the place, or other things around that may help us kind of understand it. So I think, yes, of course, character. I mean, we're taking, like Tracy said, we're taking a journey with a character. So that's always invariably like the easiest kind of structure to manage, is one character through. But yes, less important for us that the character have a huge transformation moment. They may have just lived their life, and we just now try to understand it.
Thank you. And Anna, you come from print background, and you know, the same rules that we just discussed apply to both print and audio stories. What was the most challenging part of creating audio stories?
I'm not sure that the same rules necessarily apply, and I think, as the other said, you can be, and you actually have to be more inventive and more creative with podcasts, because we learn a lot of techniques from listening to popular podcasts and from listening to Radiolab, and but they are becoming a bit maybe, as Gregory said, a bit overused. So. Actually, one of the reasons that we started the podcast was also, I found it a challenge to write for a medium that doesn't have any pictures, to experiment with some sort of script writing. So this is always a treat for me, and yes, I enjoy it when I have all those things that I want to put somewhere, and then I start one sort of thread of the way the thing is going to be, and then I realize, oh no, let's start with this one, and then I go back and forth. I actually enjoy that. It can get unnerving after a while, but it's definitely very exciting.
To put together the pieces of the narrative puzzle. I mean, with Urban Detective, you don't just stick to the present and issues relevant to, I don't know, current affairs. You also explore the past. But 30 years after the fall of communism, there's a whole generation that was brought up after the fall of the regime. So how do you tell those stories so they're relevant to this to this generation?
Well, I hope they are relevant. We've actually been going back not only to, let's say, communist times, but we've been going back to the 1944 period, so to the Third Bulgarian Kingdom, so to speak. And then lately, we've been going even back to Ottoman times and the 19th century when Sofia became a capital. So I don't know. To be honest, we are guided mostly by things that we find exciting. We are of this generation that was born in the middle of the 80s, so we have just very faint memories from how people from life before 1989. And to be honest, I find this thing fascinating, that your life can just change drastically over time, that over one night, that the life of my parents and my grandparents was just changed in a very brief amount of time, and they didn't expect it, and most of them didn't expect it. And I find this extremely interesting, and I want to explore this, and I still don't know how to actually capture. I mean, can we relive this emotion that they lived, or what do we remember from it? I think it's been kind of imprinted on us growing up in this time. So this is a reservoir of excitement for me, but I don't know I hope we manage to translate some of it.
Yeah, for our foreign attendees, the first season of the podcast is actually also in English, so you can have a listen. And actually, what you just said about using the journalistic tools for writing and then applying them maybe to audio stories or not quite, I just wanted to ask you, do you think there is a difference between a compelling story in general and a compelling audio story? Maybe Anna, you can go first this time, and then.
I think in theory, you probably can make any story, if it's a compelling story, it can be made, I think, into a compelling audio story, or in theory, if you are if you're talented, I guess. Not sure that I can make it, but I think in theory it is. And of course, there are some stories that are better suited for audio. I think maybe the others can share some insight into.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that yes, in theory, any story that is compelling on paper can be compelling on audio, or but I think the toughest part, but I mean, I think the practical considerations we always think about at Radiolab is who's going to tell this story. Are people alive? If this is a thing that happened 100 years ago, is there like some historian or journalist or writer who's a good storyteller and sounds really good on tape and can talk us and walk us through this story? Is there any archival audio that we can use to help illustrate this story? We did an episode about the 1918 flu pandemic, and we used voice actors and we used historians. We used, all sorts of people to try to take us back to that time. So yeah, it can happen, but I mean, I think there are like a lot of practical concerns as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Gregory.
Yeah, I mean, Latif, I just got to catch the end of his chat, and he was saying something smart as always about how radio basically, or podcast, exists in your head. You're walking down the street, and then you mentioned that about walking down the street, and so I think the way we receive the story is also so important in terms of the kind of story you can tell. It's oftentimes it does take place in this space in your head, and we can get in the heads of somebody because we just hear their voice in a way which makes some things just loom larger and other things become less resonant. So in theory, of course, you can tell any story, but we find that when we're taking our radio stories into print, because we also put them oftentimes a version on npr.org, we are just telling it totally differently. The intimacy that we could have just started with needs to be achieved and arrived at, and I feel like is never quite as intimate as it was on the radio.
Yeah, I very much agree. From the listening side. Now I want to ask some of the questions that we received. I mean, earlier we talked about what stories are worth pursuing. Now Mike Atkins wants to know, how do you decide that a subject is not worth reporting or telling us about?
That's cool.
to flip
Not
it.
I don't know if the right terminology is not worth reporting. I think sometimes some stories just aren't for you because they don't fit your podcast aesthetic or your point of view or the kinds of stories you're interested in. We had situations where people pitch stories to us and they would not work for us, but then they ended up on other podcasts and they were great on those other podcasts. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, because I kind of feel in theory that all stories are worth reporting, right? Yeah, but it's just like, where it goes is a different calculus altogether. And some of the reasons we've turned down stories is like, maybe they didn't fit right. Maybe we couldn't find the right talkers, like before I was talking about these practical concerns of, who can tell us the story and do we have access? If the people involved, are they going to want to talk to us? Maybe they don't. Maybe they're just not talking to the press right now. So there's lots of just kind of practical things that make stories not work necessarily for us. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that we talk a lot to our international correspondents, and these are very, very busy people who are covering all areas of the world. They don't have time legitimately to be digging into something that then we say, well, it didn't quite work out, which is we've all, having done podcast stories, have all experienced that, where you put a ton of work into something and then for some reason it just never airs. So I felt that this question is really important, and knowing earlier whether or not it's going to work. And so I don't have like a good answer, but one thing that I remember saying to the very first story we ever did, first episode of the show, which is not that long ago, 3 years ago, which took place in Brazil. And I asked Lulu Garcia Navarro, who was at the time the outgoing Brazil correspondent, and I said, what's like the thing that over the last 3 years in Brazil that you've never really been able to do a story about? And she said, well, it's race. I mean, she actually said she's done but dozens and dozens and dozens of stories on race, but she just couldn't talk about it in some way that would make sense to American audiences. So we did the story Brazil in black and white, but I think what made that work was that it was hard to tell. It was confusing even for the reporter. And whereas sometimes if the story is too known or too expected, or you're just kind of telling it because it's reporting on the topic as opposed to investigating it, I feel like sometimes that's where it can be harder. It can break down a little bit.
And speaking of stories that don't work out, again, like a follow-up from Mike, do stories have an expiration date? I mean, obviously, all the 3 podcasts, you don't cover current affairs in the sense of like news is breaking and you cover it, and in your case, do a story or a narrative have as an expiration date? Sorry. Yeah, you can start, Gregory. Yep.
I would just say I constantly feel that my stories are about to expire. Like any idea I have, I feel like either like it's not going to be relevant anymore, or so I don't know. I constantly fear this. I'm then always assured that a story is a story. So I try to remind myself that that's true. We have done stories that hit a particular moment, sometimes unfortunately. I mean, the anti-caste story that I mentioned came just for some bizarre reason the day after this incredibly brutal attack in India, and so there was maybe felt more relevant or more timely because of that, not by any reason that we would have chosen, but I think we do aim to be evergreen, which gets back to the thing that Trace and I were saying about setting a question, because if the question is the thing that can feel a little more timeless, maybe.
Tracy?
Yeah, I don't know if I have necessarily a story that that we have like a time limit on our stories. Like sometimes, once again, you do have something that is in the ether a little bit, and you want to capture the zeitgeist. We actually had to do some shuffling with our story plan because we had been working on the 1918 flu story. And speaking of things that you work on and then they don't see the light of day, like I was working on something that fell out of that episode. But anyway, so we had been working on that. Then we had the idea about me doing something about Nina Simone, because like right at that same weekend was when the George Floyd protests were hitting, did I just mute myself? Sorry. We're hitting their like peak. And so, and we also felt like putting out the 1918 story that same weekend would have been a little tone deaf. And so we did like kind of push that, we did push out the Nina Simone story that week. But yeah, I feel like that's one of the benefits about working on the type of show that we're working on, is that we're not really driven by the news cycle, but at the same time, we still have the option of responding to it and at least seeming like we're in conversation with it. That's been something that at Radiolab we've been struggling with a lot, is what do people come to Radiolab for? Do they want an escape from the news, or do they want us to go deeper on the news? And yeah, and so at the beginning of quarantine, we were like, should we be putting out more escapist things, or should we be putting out things? But we're also, we're rooted in a science, so we should be putting out stories about coronavirus. Like it was like a really kind of tricky moment to navigate, and I don't know. I think we came up with like a mishmash of of things responding to the news cycle and things not responding to the news cycle or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you. And Anna, have you started working on a story and then decided that, nah, this is not going to work out for our podcast, or?
Oh, sure. I actually, to be honest, I'm sure we have. I struggle to find an example right now. Actually, we've been wanting to do a story about it's again about communist times, and it came from a rumor or sort of a myth that there was a protest, actually a gay march in the 60s in Sofia, which seems, and so far in our investigation, we cannot find any actual support for that statement. And we wanted, but nevertheless, we wanted to investigate the topic of how the regime was treating gay people. But we are really struggling, and as Tracy said, we're really struggling to find anyone who is willing to talk, even on audio, even when we say, tell us your story and we'll get an actor to recreate it. People just, we just haven't found our speakers yet. This is actually the second year I've been saying this in an interview. Last year at a similar forum, we were asked a similar question. I was like, yeah, and I hope next year we manage to find them. And please, people, if you know somebody. And yeah, it's still relevant. We're still trying to find them.
Yeah, I would love to listen to that episode, actually. Gay Pride March during communism. That's quite interesting. Well, I've been going back and forth myself to whether to ask you about the pandemic or not. Now that Tracy mentioned it, I think I'm gonna ask you a bit, and because again, I oscillated between wanting an escape and not hearing anything about the pandemic, and I'm sure many listeners probably did the same, and or like having a story about going back to 1918 with Radiolab or the Hotel Corona that Rough Translation did, that were actually quite interesting, and I didn't feel, I don't know, burdened by what's happening in the world now. So did the pandemic change the way or we tell or you tell stories, or like finding a fresh angle and like kind of avoiding this trap of having like a trite tale?
I would say the pandemic, as for everybody, changed like so much of what we do. I mean, I had certain trips planned that immediately were not taken, and so suddenly, if travel is not possible, that changes an international show for sure. But in another way, I think the thesis of our show has always been that that the in some sense we're all going through similar things, and I don't mean that in the kind of Disney World kind of way, but for instance, when people talk about I don't know, the presidency of Donald Trump as something singular in the U.S., there's many movements like Trump's movement, many figures like Trump in different parts of the world. So and you can look at like parallels like that in a lot of ways, and we've exploited that to understand things that are happening in the U.S. by taking a trip other places. The pandemic is like the ultimate example of that. We could literally go anywhere and understand how we're all dealing with the same virus and yet dealing with it in such different ways. And that teaches you so much about who we are. So I feel like we're not at this point doing pandemic related stories only because we kind of ourselves got tired of them, but for a while it is what allowed us to sort of up our output and become a more regular show as opposed to seasonal.
Yeah, I would say that for Radiolab, I think we've done a couple of stories that were very pandemic related. We, in our Dispatch series that we had out earlier this summer, and we've also done a lot of stories that were maybe in the hopper. We were working on them before the pandemic struck. And then they just sort of like took on new meaning in a post-pandemic world. A really good example of that is Octomom, our story about the octopus living under the ocean by herself, trying to keep her little baby octopi safe. That one from Annie McCune. And so like that didn't start as a pandemic related story. I mean, it is not about the pandemic, but it feels like the pandemic, when you listen to it. So we definitely have a lot of stories like that. My AIDS story was something that wasn't about the pandemic, but yeah, looking back at a public health crisis that the government didn't do a good job of responding to, feels like a pandemic, so there's definitely a lot of stories like that. And, at Radiolab, we kind of call those stories that like stories that are looking at the thing, but kind of in like almost looking at the thing, but it's not really about the thing. And so those are like a lot of the stories we've been doing as well. Those stories that are like kind of in that middle place of not being about it, but sort of are about it. But yeah. And that also kind of like fits with somebody's question earlier about relevancy, because sometimes things take on different relevances over time. You know.
Exactly. And I just recalled a quote from Nina Simone in that episode that you did, where, you know, what she said during that performance, it sounded like a warning to us today, and very relevant to what's happening at the moment. And actually, there is a question for you. Teodora Berzakova has always wondered how much of the conversation that you hear between the presenter and the producer who is telling the story on Radiolab are actually rehearsed and scripted?
So a lot of it is unscripted. So I think a lot of shows like invented this. Gregory can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot more radio shows do this now, called the brain dump. Which is when the reporter and the host go into the studio, and the reporter essentially about their story, and it can take, you know, an hour of you know, just going back and forth, and then you do use that that raw material, that brain dump tape, as your script. That doesn't mean that everything in the final product is completely unscripted. Like, a lot of it will be scripted, because sometimes you do have to write words, but a lot of it is unscripted. And so that's how you get that back and forth. And our host, Jad Abumrad, he tells the story about how he'd been working on a Radiolab piece with a reporter, and he found that whenever they track it, he was really bored by the story, wasn't that interested in it. But when they would take a break and walk around the block to get a coffee or something, and she'd be talking about it just casually to him, he was like all in, super, super excited about it. And so he basically brought that walk around the block, getting a coffee energy into the studio. And so that's how that's kind of how we get that sort of that unscripted, unrehearsed sound. And you know, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how that's why the reporter being excited about the story and being interested, and the reporter sort of being allowed to follow what they find exciting and interesting about a story, is important, because they have to do that brain dump, and they have to like perform in it a little bit. And it falls flat if they're just like, you know, if they're not really if they're very meh about it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I can keep asking you questions, but we're running out of time. So with one sentence, I just wanted to ask you, when it comes to storytelling and, let's say, budding podcasters, what's one piece of advice you could give them? But very briefly, with one sentence. Tracy, you go first.
Reporting is very important. It's the most important part of the whole thing.
Okay, thank you. Anna, it's your turn.
Most people actually want to talk and want to be asked questions. And also, I can add, a car sometimes make a great sound booth.
Thank you. And Gregory?
I would say, I used to tell people, don't live in New York. But that's not really relevant to certainly this crowd. But I suppose if you can put yourself in a place where things are happening, or you realize that things are happening in a way that are not part of the general conversation. I mean, you get yourself out of a media conversation and into the field, whatever the field means, and then tell us stories from the field is sort of like the essence of reporting.
Remember the before times when you can actually do
I have no idea what that means.
The
Zoom field.
Yeah, exactly.
Ay, ay.
Hopefully.
Get on
Go
the
ahead.
phone and get on Zoom and talk to everybody you can if you can't get in the field.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good pandemic advice as well. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Just to our audience, don't forget to join us tomorrow when we actually have a session with Gregory, who will tell us how to tell stories from faraway places that hit close to home, followed by another very interesting panel discussion about the unlikely rise of news podcasts. So consult your agenda on the conference website, and please join us again at the time, depending on the time zone in the country where you are. Gregory, Tracy, Anna, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talking with you. And
Good.
yeah, I can't wait to see you again, Gregory, tomorrow.
No, it was a huge pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.